I used to jump out of airplanes in the military, and the only thing I knew when that door opened up and 60 paratroopers were going to exit at 3 o'clock in the morning, the plan we had drawn up for hours and hours was not going to go as we developed. In the military, we try really hard to understand that our job as a lieutenant is to learn. The first thing I did when I joined Procter Gamble is I listened a lot.
And so when you go into a new company, what's your construct, your mindset when you walk in there?
First of all, there's no playbook. Every company's culture is going to help dictate what will work. And I don't believe in 90-day plans. I'd prefer to go slow to go fast. If you publish a 90-day plan, there's a lot of pressure to go deliver that. And then do you make trade-offs or shortcuts?
On this episode of Executive Edge, Greg welcomes Jim.
Jim is a former Army Airborne Engineer with 25 years in supply chain leadership.
He shares hard-earned lessons on leading through crisis, motivating teams, working with suppliers, and setting up for success in a new role.
How do you look at supplier relationship management, maybe as it relates to the CPG industry?
They're an integral part of the supply chain, and I've begun to evolve that they're an extension of the supply chain. It all starts with...
Welcome to the Executive Edge podcast. My name is Greg Anderson, and I'm a partner with Tenzing. My guest today is a seasoned leader in operations and supply chain management, Jim O'Rourke. With 25 years of experience, Jim has held pivotal roles at industry giants like ConAgra Brands, the J.M. Smucker Company, and Procter Gamble. He's developed and executed procurement strategies for teams managing billions in spend and has been instrumental in optimizing supply chains across diverse sectors. Most recently, the Senior Vice President and Chief Procurement Officer at Treehouse Foods, Jim is an expert in procurement and supply chain operations. His career journey also includes a distinguished tenure in the U.S. Army as an airborne combat engineer, where he honed his leadership and logistical experience. In this episode, we'll delve into Jim's extensive career, exploring the strategies and insights that have shaped his approach to supply chain leadership and operational excellence. Jim, it's great to have you here today. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Greg. Good morning, and thanks for the kind introduction.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and look forward to the conversation. So let's get started. Dive right in, Jim. You came out of the military, and I'd really like our audience to understand, what was it like for you to transition from that military profession into a civilian, if you will, career, and what did you observe and experience when that happened?
Yeah, so when I was transitioning, I used a search firm that specialized in junior military officers to help with that transition. And there's several out there, all high caliber. And they prepared us by having a reading list, a professional reading list. And so I read things like Deming Management, Quality is Free by Crosby, Good to Great. And it gave me an idea of what corporate America was like, but candidly, I didn't know. And when I joined, I was fortunate I went to Procter Gamble. And at the time, the CEO was John Pepper. He was a naval officer before he joined Procter. He was succeeded by A.G. Lafley, who also served in the Navy. And Procter knew what they were getting. But it still, when I showed up in a plant in Tennessee, I realized that a lot of the other leaders in that plant didn't understand the military officer, and there was a lot of misnomers. I was asked several times, well, this is going to be hard because you were always in charge and giving orders, and people did what you said because you were the leader. And I gently would share, it doesn't really work that way. Sure, it's a team of 40 people we might be leading, but first and foremost, all of my sergeants are older than me and more experienced. And at 23 years old, having 40 people was daunting, and today I would say quite scary. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so the first thing is, in the military, we try really hard to understand that our job as a lieutenant is to learn. And that means we speak last. And so the first thing I did when I joined Procter Gamble is I listened a lot. Today I say I learn a lot more when I'm listening than when I'm talking. But that was an important part of transitioning because I was coming in, I had a chemical engineering degree. I hadn't used it since I graduated college. And so I listened a lot and I asked people, what did success look like? And in this plan, I was fortunate. There were several military officers who had transitioned. And we tried very hard not to be a fraternity because we didn't want to be seen as cliquish, but rather we supported each other quietly. And I think that's another important element that people don't understand. In the military, you're a peer leader before you're an actual leader. As a cadet going through training, you rotate. So one day you're the squad leader, one day you're the platoon sergeant, one day you're the platoon leader. And at that moment, you're accountable for everything that that group of people that do or don't do. And you learn quickly that leadership is a cooperate to graduate activity. And you try very hard to make sure when you're not in charge that you do everything you can to support the leader. And most military officers come with that mentality. We're there to support our leader, we're there to support our peers. And you can be a peer leader, a very strong peer leader, without actually being in charge. Can you help others, but can we learn from each other? So there's a lot of team effort that goes into that. Of course, leaders come with leadership. Usually, since they were 19 years old, they've had some experience with 5, 6 people as a team leader and moving up. But we also come with an idea of agility and adaptability. I used to jump out of airplanes in the military, and the only thing I knew when that door opened up and 60 paratroopers were going to exit at 3 o'clock in the morning, the plan we had drawn up for hours and hours was not going to go as we developed. And that was okay because we always had contingencies. And so one of the things that I came into this plant with was a sense of, okay, what else are we thinking about for this project? What else are we thinking about for this scenario? And some of my peers would be like, well, why do you ask those questions? I said, because a plan never is perfect, right? And it leads to, at Procter, what I learned is this leadership model that at the time I didn't think about what it was, Greg, but in hindsight, it really makes a lot of sense. And the first thing, anybody who's a leader, right, you have to share with what they call the envision. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And coming off the envision element where you've painted the picture or the journey, now you have to go and engage. And you have to ask others the inclusion principle. How do you think we should do this? Are there better ways to tackle this problem? Are there better solutions? And once you have the engagement, now you have to think about the empower. And what is each of our role? Because ownership is one of the most powerful things as a leader that you can delegate. And when someone owns a part of that project, a part of that mission, they find very quickly that they want to get it right. Because we all want to succeed. Almost all of us want to succeed. And certainly the DNA of a military officer is to get the mission done. The next thing, though, is enable, right? In the military, Greg, we often talk about mission first, people always. And you would look at that and say, well, does that even make sense? Because bad things happen in bad situations. But it says there should not be trade-offs. A leader doesn't go into a scenario knowing that they're putting their people in danger. They're there for the welfare and the support of the team. And every time that I had harm's way staring the team, I wanted to make sure we all had a chance to come back with minimum impact. And the thing I'm most proud of is I never had somebody get severely injured or even didn't come home from where we were serving. So that is enablement, right? Understanding the team, leadership's a contact sport. What does the team need for skills, systems, tools? Do we need another person? You know, in the military, we're not afraid to ask for help. And so in that enable, if we feel we don't have the skill set, then we'll add that. And then the last D is execute. And you say, well, of course, you have to execute. But execution is more than just saying, am I red, green, yellow? Execute is, are we on track? Are we on pace? And do we need to course correct? And that's okay. And I think that's where the agility comes in. So as I was transitioning and I look back, some of these things were inherent. Now I'm more conscious about it, more self-aware. But I would say that most military officers who join corporate America still have that ethos and that DNA runs in their veins. Sure, we've all learned and adapted, but I'm grateful for the team at Procter Gamble in that Jackson, Tennessee plant to see something in me and give me an opportunity to join a world-class organization, certainly, but to learn what it was like to lead in corporate America, because it is certainly different, but a lot of the principles hold.
You said leadership maybe 20 times, I think, in your reply there, and I loved it. I'm a big leadership enthusiast, I guess I would call myself. And, you know, I had the good fortune to go through GE, so it's not unlike your experience probably at Procter and Gamble. And, you know, I always found that you sort of find the right things, and even coming out of the military, you find the right things to take forward and sort of incorporate into your leadership ethos and your style. if you will. And it's a continuous, and I think that's what's great about getting exposed to different companies and different environments, is that you find that there's a lot of different ways to get things done, which sort of ties back to when you're running that mission or when you're working on a project and thinking, okay, what if something doesn't go according to plan? Chances are it won't, right? It prepares you to, to be ready with an alternate and things like that. So I think there's a lot of, you laid out a lot of things that get translated from the, the military world into the corporate world that are very applicable. And leadership, I think, is first and foremost there. So that's awesome.
Yeah, great. One thing, if I might add,
Sure.
I didn't mention culture. And so when I think of people I transitioned with to different companies, they might have had the same DNA, but they didn't realize the culture they had come into. And
Right.
so there again, Procter, like GE, very strong culture as we both experience young in our careers. But what works in that culture? And just because, Jack Welch and John Pepper and A.G. Lafley would say they were like-minded in how to run a business, it doesn't change the fact that GE was a different culture than Procter and Gamble. And where I had friends who struggled or even didn't make it in the transition at Procter, they didn't realize the culture and they didn't embrace the culture. And that's one of those things that has carried me through. There's no playbook. Every company's culture is going to help dictate what will work there to be successful for the team, certainly for the company. And that is something that I think is also equally important.
Yeah, good point. Culture, right? It eats strategy for lunch. They say that for a reason.
Mhm.
So let's transition. Let's go into you're moving along your career. I want to hear one of the toughest jobs that you ever had. Tell me a story about that, because you had a really interesting transition you made right around a time when the country went into the whole world went into a pretty crazy time around COVID. So can you tell us that story and sort of what happened and how did you adapt? Talk about a game plan going sideways. This is the ultimate go sideways experience. So tell us what happened and what you did to address the situation when COVID struck and you were taking a new position.
Yeah, so it was right at that time when things were changing rapidly and social distancing was coming along. And I joined Vanguard as their chief procurement officer. And I drove to Pennsylvania from Chicago, where I had been. And when I arrived, my new boss called me and said, okay, everything's still in plan. You're going to start on Monday, but we have vacated the offices for a 2-week period because somebody tested positive for the COVID disease. And she said, but it's okay. I'm going to meet you in the office and get you oriented and spend the week with you. And then we'll only be a week away. And I thought, okay, plans modified slightly, but I knew I had a lot to learn. Vanguard's a very strong culture. And they were really looking to understand where they could take procurement from a back office function to more of a front office function, interacting with the business more and really putting a strategic agenda together. And so I knew what we wanted to accomplish. And at the end of the first week, I had met my team on Teams, all my directs. I had a town hall that week and just explained who I was. And I can remember sharing enthusiastically. I always do a slide, what's Jim all about? And one of the things is I'm a leader who walks around and managed by walking around. I get to know my team. Leadership is a contact sport. I learned that in Korea, serving on the demilitarized zone as my first assignment. And I was excited to meet these people. I told all the one-down reports that we were going to have one-to-ones in the first 2 weeks and get to know them and get to know me. And then week 2 started and we extended another week. And so we all hung on. I had a staff meeting, did one-to-ones with my team, and then things really went crazy and everybody was indefinite. So here I am living in a residence inn in the middle of Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, Malvern. And I said, this is going to be different. So the first thing that I thought about was, this is not a scenario that I had spent any time worrying about. And I went back to those 5 E's. And so I had a special staff meeting and I talked to the team and I said, okay, we will be looking at screens for a while in all likelihood. So let's talk about what we need to do together and how we need to form as a team in a very different environment. And I was very candid. I said, I have never been in a situation like this. Honestly, I didn't really like the Zoom at the time and a little bit of the team technology because I wanted to see people face to face and get to build that relationship. And so I think being vulnerable that I didn't know what we needed to do sort of gave them permission to then also share that they were worried, scared people. We had folks that had daycare children and that was shut down, all kinds of family scenarios. And so the first thing I said is, okay, so let's do this. Town halls are once a month. Let's more frequently communicate. And we started to brainstorm and come up with the list of how to stay in touch and give people a sense of belonging in a very different environment. And at the same time, we were actually onboarding other leaders in the organization a couple layers down. So over communicate was the ethos of the day. I usually started with the team in the morning to check in. Everybody was on speed dial on my leadership team so that we could connect anytime because things came up pretty dynamically and we couldn't walk over to see each other. And I found out as I did do the skip level discussions with people, and I found out that people were yearning for that water cooler connection. And they missed just hearing from their peers. The team was very fragmented. Siloed might be too strong, but what each team did from P2P to the IT procurement team to the facilities team to the risk management team, they weren't necessarily connected. And I could feel it was growing in that gap. So I asked the leadership team before I did it, because I wanted that inclusion principle. I said, well, what if I just did a connection once a week and we had approximately 110 people and I just meet with 10 or 12 folks, invite them to this thing I'm going to call Java with Jim. And it just gives them a chance to get to know me on a different level because I'm not going to be able to sit down or host lunches. And it will go where the energy is, right? The first one was dead silence. And I was like, oh boy, I failed on this one. No one wants to talk. And it's funny, peer leadership we talked about, the peer leaders began to emerge. And people were very polite and they would actually raise their hand on Teams. I don't think the raise hand function was well known or being used. Right. And I'd say, yeah, of course, Stephanie, what's on your mind? Brad, what do you think? And those peer leaders, I was really impressed that they modeled the behavior for others on the team who were more unsure, uncertain, worried, all of the above, permission to speak. And the Javas would usually pivot to about 15 minutes of business, what's going on. And we would spend about 45 minutes talking things that might have been at the water cooler, might have been when they had a chance to just have lunch together. And we had these like peer-to-peer conversations. I was like, okay, well, this has momentum. And I think word spread that they were all talking behind the scenes. And I knew that, hey, Jim's not such a bad person. More importantly, he's listening, he wants to learn, and it's okay to speak up. He wants to know what we need, the enable to continue to be successful. And so they got better and they got stronger. And in about a month, then I heard from the team in these breakouts, well, I'm a single parent, and this is really hard because I don't have any childcare. And we really had to then think about what's going to work for each person's scenario and break that 8 to 5 cycle, because not everybody could do that, or they were dual spouses and they were all on screens all day. And so we learned to be flexible as long as the work was getting done. So my leaders had to change as well, and all the way down the organization. And then we actually developed what we would call today our ERG groups, or employee resource groups. And we found common folks, elementary school kids at home learning while I'm working, single parent who has to model this. And we formed these smaller affinity groups, and we would host these breakout sessions. And, what do you need? So as I think back, not a scenario I ever imagined. I certainly learned a lot. I was very appreciative that my leadership team was part of that journey. And the most exciting part is we did create our vision. We did move at pace for what we needed to do. proud of the organization to get much more connected with the business. And I would deem that everything that the team did was appreciated and we were successful through that journey. And it was probably the greatest challenge in my career leadership wise, because while I had been in scenarios I'd never seen before, high pressure, high stake scenarios, this was a do or fail. And,
Right.
so those stakes were very high. And if it wasn't for having a great leadership team that both helped me learn the culture, appreciate the culture, learn about the people that I didn't get to see in person, we made it as a team. And that was the most important element, is we figured out how to gel as a team in very different circumstances.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. You know, I think as a leader, right, you have a duty of care, right? And certainly, it sounds like you came up with these employee resource groups to help your people overcome new challenges that were, not anticipated and maybe never there before, right? How do I take care of my kids and do my job and, keep up with all this? So, yeah, I remember it. We took a very personalized approach where I was at the time to say, look, let's first make sure our people are safe and they feel comfortable. Second, let's make sure they're connected and that they can get in touch, and and we're just going to have to figure out how to work in this sort of an environment. I like you. I like to walk around and talk to people. Management by walking around is what we called it back in the day, I think. And
Mhm. I
sounds
think
like
it
you have the
still is
same
in some
training.
scenarios, yeah.
Yeah, right. And it helped you to understand how to motivate people. And if I had two people out on a shop floor back in the day when I was a plant manager, to get the same task done, I might have to approach one person completely differently than the other, right? Because
Mhm.
of their personality and their skill set. And I think that's a lot of what I learned about when I was in leadership classes myself. So it sounds like you did the very best you could under those circumstances, pulled the team together, and were able to accomplish what you needed to accomplish there. So did procurement move from that back office toward a more strategic place in the business as a result?
We were able to put key people on the BU leadership team, so they knew what was coming, able to get ahead of a lot of the strategic agenda. Vanguard at the time was also morphing, getting much more brand facing. As you see today, there's a lot of commercials, and that journey was very nascent at the time. And so there was a lot of change happening at Vanguard under tough circumstances, and other leaders also learned to adapt and adjust. Yeah, but you mentioned something, Greg, the enable part. We had folks that didn't have peripheral IT equipment at home to be successful, right? And we've all learned two screens is so important, and a good speaker. And we had folks that didn't have that, a good camera. And we had to also make sure they had what they needed to succeed in the field. And kudos to the IT team, because they were very busy at that time. And my team for trying to go find that in a time of scarcity, right? It wasn't just protective equipment and ingredients and packaging that factories weren't running. But, I think back, it's like, yeah, that IT equipment was a very important element to keep people connected. And then the last thing I did, just that check-in. For some folks, I knew I sort of had permission to reach out, and I got closer to some of the folks deeper in the organization. I would just call them to check in, because they were those peer leaders that spoke up in the first couple of Javas. And I would say, how is the team doing? What are you hearing? I know people come to you. Obviously, I'm not going to go back and say Stephanie said or Jen said, but what can I do to help? And so I also adapted on leaning on some of those peer leaders, because I knew folks were connecting with them, and I had to build that trust in that line of communication. And it would cut both ways. It's like, okay, if you want to call me at any time, then let's do it.
Impresses me how it just comes natural to you, Jim, right? It's not like you need to think about, oh, I need to do this, right? It's a trait I think you've developed through your career as a leader to do that. And that's pretty cool.
I'm grateful to my mentors, right? Nobody gets to where they are alone. And the investment that people made in me in my career, all the way back to the Army. I'm still in touch with some of the leaders I worked for in the Army. We're great friends today. Talked to a couple of them last week, and we're going to get together next month on a field trip to one of their farms. But people who invested in me, right? And so I think as a leader, we've got to pay it back. And where people have invested in us, and whether it's a short term, we're on the same team, I want to know how to support you, or a longer relationship. And that's something that I do today. I mentor several people in organizations I've been in and outside, and I help quite a few veterans transition as well. So they can not have to learn some of the lessons that I did when I started in corporate America.
That's great, right? Yeah, people say all the time, how do you? I said you got to pay it forward.
Mm-hmm.
If there weren't people looking out for me that didn't see something in me and decided to invest, that I was worth investing in, of their
Mm-hmm.
time, of their guidance, and early on, I got straightened out pretty directly by a few
Mm-hmm.
people, right?
Right.
In factory environments, right? And but they were leaders. They were these peer leaders, right? And they really helped to shape what I did. And I say now my obligation is to make sure I'm helping sort of the people coming behind me with the same sort of advice and the same sort of guidance and coaching and pushing. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think without others, you really can't really reach your full potential. And it's
Mm-hmm.
that first person or a couple of people that believe in you really make a difference, I think, in your career. So
I agree, and especially in operations, right? Because we both know scorecard was very obvious. You made your goal for the day, or you
right,
didn't,
right,
and there was nowhere to hide. And as in the military, it's accountability is always there. And what you'll see, especially for the junior officers, is they'll hold themselves accountable and they'll tell on themselves. Maybe that the boss doesn't know,
right,
before they would take credit, and then they'll share credit to that end. Because corporate America is a team effort, of course, but operations is probably the tippy point of the spear to do that, and a great environment for those that are looking to get out. Anywhere you can start is great in a great company.
right.
But yeah, it could be brutal in that those days of operations. Third shift was always a fun time.
Yes, yes, for sure. So Jim, next I want to talk about when you move into a new organization. You've worked for several really nice, well-known name brand firms, and each time you make that change, right, you have to go in and figure it out. I assume very often you're taking the team on a transformative journey. You're there to say take procurement or supply chain to the next level, or operations to a new place. And so when you go into a new company you just joined, and do you have a game plan that you sort of follow for that, or how do you think about it? What's your construct, your mindset when you walk in there?
So first of all, I don't take a playbook and reapply it. Back to how strong a culture can be and how important it is. I want to know what will work. And I don't believe in 90-day plans. I believe in touching base with all the stakeholders, what's working, what's not working in the function, what needs to be true for both of our teams to be successful, right? Eliminate silos. So in that listening tour, as I learn, I always circle back and I start to share ideas and thoughts of maybe some best practices I have used that would work in that environment. And I'll listen to the feedback. There's this concept I created at Smucker that I coined it a SPOC, a strategic point of contact. But it's that person from the team to be on different business leadership teams, to be on other function leadership teams, to really stay in touch. And it's a conduit. That person is there to share what's happening in procurement on a macro level,
Mm-hmm.
and to hear from the business. And then it's incumbent on them to come back to the broader org and share what's needed for the bacon and snacks business, for where I just came from, or for the coffee business to win. And so that's a best practice, but I'm always cautious before I deploy that, because I want to make sure, one, I'll have the buy-in and the support, because if that person shows up and they expect them to know everything about commodities, ingredients, packaging, indirects, that's not going to happen. And conversely, if they expect to get an answer the next day, these people all have day jobs. They're usually strong category managers or directors. And that's an example where it's a best practice, but I don't deploy a playbook where how I've used it at Procter was different than Smucker, is different than Conagra, and so on. But then once I have that listening tour, however long it takes, I make sure that in a strategy plan, I share that very broadly with all those key leaders that I met with. And of course, my leadership team. Is this something we can buy into? Is this something we can all align to? And we think out the other side, it's going to make us better as a function, and it's going to help the company. So that takes a little bit of time, but I think it's time well invested because it avoids a lot of the misfires, right? There's the old joke we've both heard is ready, fire, aim, and then you've got to come back to the firing line and start over. I'd prefer to go slow to go fast. A friend of mine told me that a while ago, one of those folks that invested in me. And that, I think, has served me well because it's not artificial. If you publish a 90-day plan, there's a lot of pressure to go deliver that. And then do you make trade-offs or shortcuts? The other thing as I start up, especially, I learned this in the Army, Greg, but there's a concept of control by report and control by exception. And control by report would be check in very regularly with your management, tell them what's going on, ask for their thoughts, checking in with your leadership team before you make big decisions, right? That inclusion principle. And I put myself on that, and I probably over communicate. And I'm okay with that because I'd rather make that correction midstream before it's done and we have to unwind something. As maturity in a role, time in a role, capability and knowledge grow, that's where the control by exception comes in. And that's where your leadership knows that you'll come to them, I'll come to them if I need help, if there's a problem. It's the no surprise rule in the control by exception. Yeah. But that takes a while. And I usually, maybe not overtly ask permission to go to that exception, but I'll say, okay, we've been meeting every week, twice a week. I think we're in a good spot. We both have our cadence. Are you all right if we do it once a week or once every other week? But I ask permission to move even from that. And I don't call it control by report, control by exception per se. I just over communicate and check in.
I think when you started to talk that your listening tour, right? I've done a lot of focus interviews with executives. I love doing it because it seems like after, the N equals 30 is statistically significant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember that.
Population, that's right. Yeah.
Right. What a little I remember from statistics. But do you notice that on your listening tour about, 5 or 6 people, and you're starting to already see the themes, right? The themes are emerging. Like, okay, I understand. It may be a cultural theme within the company. It might be you can tell there's been some antagonistic, maybe relationships within a company. And it starts to shape you. But I love that because it gets you such a read on the organization. And then as a leader of a function, let's say in this case, procurement, you know how to best align what your team is doing with the needs of the business and help drive the most impact for them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's that understanding that you develop by listening is the best thing you can do, I think, when you go into a new company, is really try to figure it out, wallow in it for a while, I say, mm-hmm. and really understand, like, how do things work around here? What have they tried in the past that didn't work? Why didn't it work, right? All those questions. Mm-hmm. One of the leaders in my early career, a VP at GE, said, ask a million questions when you go in somewhere new. And it works, right? So suddenly you start to ask the same question of several different people, not to try to trip people up, but just what's your perspective on this? And you start to understand, okay, now I think I know where we need to take this ship to be successful. So it's great that you go in and do that. So you have a framework when you go in, I guess, is what I want to close with on that. A framework of how do I understand and what works, but it's not a game plan. Like, we're going to start here and fix this, that, then the next thing, and then we're going to move on to these other 5 things. Yes. It's really develop the understanding first, then come up with a strategy.
Exactly. Right on, Greg. And the other thing, I love your couple of detractors, right? Those five or six people. But even in that, feedback's a gift. And A long time ago, I learned if you don't want to know the answer, don't ask.
Don't ask the question. No,
Be
no.
prepared.
Um,
And
well,
in those situations, I don't get defensive. My favorite is just tell me more. Let's
yeah,
unpack. Tell me more. And in right, you think about the discover your strengths. I think it's evolved to now Gallup's poll, but they talk about the woo, the winning others over. I'm not a natural woo, but through that calibration of hearing those themes, to your point, okay, who do I need to work extra hard to get close to? In one case, real example, horrible relationship with an entire function where I came in as the leader. And I actually said, well, why don't we just get our leadership teams together once a month and let's go work through this and let's talk before this thing ferments and gets worse. Let's have a conversation and make it open dialogue. And there again, it goes back to the group dynamics. Who's going to be permission to speak and who's going to start the conversation and be real. But it is important because those relationships, especially if it's operations, quality, regulatory, finance, they have to be humming along for a procurement function or a supply chain function to be successful.
absolutely. That's awesome. Great. Okay, where I want to go now is into, say, the CPG world. You've spent great amount of time in the consumer packaged goods world, right? A lot of them, I believe, are fast-moving consumer packaged goods, if I can get that more specific about it, right?
Mhm.
Food products, right? Stuff we see on the grocery shelves. And you have a passion for supplier relationship management. When we prepared for this,
Yeah.
talked about what would you like to talk about in CPG. So I really want to go kind of deep here on how do you look at supplier relationship management and getting sort of the most out of those relationships and making wins for not just the company you're serving, but the supplier needs to win as well. I think that's the ultimate if we can pull that off. So maybe expand on your thoughts about supplier relationship management, maybe as it relates to the CPG industry, and sprinkle in a couple stories for us.
Yeah, Greg, you're right. It is a passion of mine. And the reason why you said it in the question, it's about win-win. And if I look at supplier relationships, especially in a fast-moving consumer goods company, they're an integral part of the supply chain. And I've begun to evolve that they're an extension of the supply chain. And it all starts with who are the most important or the most critical suppliers. And some people call this the triage. And you look at tiering. It could be a first tier, second tier, third tier. There's other ways to do it, ABC suppliers. Usually the C are the tail. And a lot of suppliers, not a lot of important spend, but could be MRO and things that are, you have to keep the plants running. The mid-tier is interesting because those are the potential emergers. Could you consolidate more spend? Could you do things differently with them? Would you eliminate some of them? Do you need 4 maltodextrin suppliers in a food company? And so those are keep an eye on. And the emerging suppliers that are most important or the critical, that's usually 75 to 80% of the spend, and it probably is 40 to 50 suppliers at most CPG food companies. I start with that, and we think about, do we scorecard our suppliers? That's a very important element. But that is not us scorecarding them. It's talking to the supplier. Well, how do your other customers interact? How do your best customers give you that feedback? And making sure you can have a forum for discussion. And in learning from those suppliers, we then, in my experience, need to even subdivide the top 5 or 6 of those 40 to who's most important, who has the most ability to help us, and where can we learn and help them understand our needs. An example would be a corrugate supplier. Odds are a corrugate supplier is going to touch all of your plants and all of your product. And there are some that want to go bid that every 2 or 3 years, even today, as the consolidation has happened. And what I've always tried to do is talk to that supplier and the executive team about what could we do together. And I look at it as if the supplier and the customer agree to that 5E model and where we want to go, and are willing to invest some time and resources, 1+1 can be 3. It really can be more than just combinational. It can be transformational. And in that discovery, what I try to do is today I would call it a governance, but who's talking to whom, right? If you think about the old model, usually there was one person from the customer, one person from the supplier, point to point, right? I think they called that the diamond model back in the day. And then that butterfly model. And, so one to one, point to point. I think what's more powerful is the diamond, where you have different functions talking. And what I try to do, get alignment internally from operations, quality, could be engineering if there's a heavy CapEx, could be other functions, usually finance is included, and match that with the supplier, who's the customer service leader, who's the operations leader, who's the executive in charge of the account, and then build a strategic agenda together. What do we want to go work on? And a lot of people put a laundry list together for strategy just in general, in my observation. But in strategy, you're really making choices. And what are the things we want to work on and we want to work on together? And then this is where the rubber has to meet the road and some of these opportunities fall apart. When you define win-win, it can't be big win, little win. It can't be I win and you lose. It should be, on the whole, what are we going to do together? The example there would be I had a very, very large, well-known ingredient supplier who made value-add ingredients, but they made a lot of commodity ingredients. And in doing this relationship, their goal was to have 100% of my business. And I said, okay, back to maltodextrin. Are you going to give me the best price I can get on the market? Because that's really a capacity utilization, supply to demand play for any supplier. And there's a lot of suppliers. And they would be like, well, no, but we're doing this special, relationship. We're investing time, resources, my technical resources, your R&D folks, my R&D folks. I said, yes, and are you going to give me the very best? Because if I go to market, I can only do that once or twice if I keep giving you. And so in that case, we looked at the value-added ingredients. We looked at the ingredients that they wanted to develop together. And we agreed that there was more margin for them and more value for me. And the commodity basket, we let them look at, but there was no preferential treatment. And if they came in and had a need to cover a little more volume and could do opportunistic pricing, that was fine. But those rules get very tricky. And that's where the relationships are hard, because you have to explain on each side what happens. And then the harder part, I think, is internally. If you have this top 5 relationship and something happens, each organization can get overly excited. Well, how could that be? They're super preferred and I've met with them. Well, we're in supply chain. And the one thing we know in supply chain is things are not always going to go right. Stuff's going to happen on third shift. Weather's going to happen and we're going to miss a shipment. But let's go look at that. Let's go do the why root cause analysis together. And how can we get better? Or how can we eliminate systemic issues? And the fun part of that, when done right, is a lot of mutual discovery. I have had 3 or 4 suppliers together, non-compete, walk an operations line in a manufacturing plant and talk about how everybody could change a little bit and make the manufacturing operation go smoother, better, and everybody could grow and replace non-efficient ingredients, non-efficient unit ops, and really think differently. And I love that outside in lens, because a supplier sees so many customers. They go to so many plants and they're coming in just saying, this is what could work, may not be perfect. And that opportunity list is usually what populates the future of what we work on together. The last thing about having that segmentation, whether it's that top supplier, top 5, or the other 40, is how do you have a community develop? And I've always looked to put a supplier summit together and let that supplier know once a year, these are the strategies of the company I'm with. This is what we're going to work on. They get to hear from all the heads of and what their role could be. And what I love about those execs is they usually say, and we want the feedback. So they reinforce, we want to become a better customer, or we want to be your best customer. And the reaction from some of these suppliers is there's nobody else who does this. There's nobody else who treats us in a way where we get all of the info. Yeah, we could go to your investor relations deck, or we could go to your CAGNY presentation, but to hear it firsthand and have a whole day immersed and a lunch where senior execs are sprinkled across these tables, always assigned seating, non-compete, most importantly, right? You don't want competitors next to each other. But I think that loop of feedback and what could we do better is well received, and that's the part where I think some companies don't want to invest in that final part of the execution. So those are some of the things that I think about on supplier relation management. But when done right, productivity can flow both ways. Let's take cost out of the system. Innovation can move faster. What's holding us back? Problems get solved quickly because everybody wants to make the other party happy. And those relationships are enduring. Those aren't the suppliers that we want to change unless something's radically different or they were bought out. So the value for the supplier is we'll mutually take cost out of the system, joint value creation, as I call it, for that win-win. We'll work on things that are bugging both. You have an inefficient case pack. Well, let's go talk about that. Or that ingredient you could send us in bulk. Okay, well, let's go figure out how we do that together. And I've even gain shared some of that, Greg, where recognizing that the supplier has to pay for those resources, pay for all the people that are on the account, we'll gain share it at some split so that they can come back and say, well, no, this thing is more than paying for itself. We're getting renewals and we get to keep some of the savings to reinvest. So those are, I think those are the key elements, but let me pause there because I learn more when I'm listening.
Yeah, we'll see if I can teach anything here. I don't know if I can teach a veteran of CPG like you, but in general, what I see with a lot of clients is, and what I've seen through the years is, sometimes they'll box a supplier into a certain way of doing business, and it's costing them more money, right? And I say, hey, maybe the supplier has a better idea. Let them come in, let them walk the line. Maybe it is, like you said, a case pack needs to be slightly different, and that will take some cost out. I think the suppliers have ideas, and you need to set up a positive and the right environment for them to unleash those ideas in a safe way, if you will, but in a way where you're not just looking to take it all from them. And, it's got to be a win-win, like we said, got to be a give and take there.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, though, when it comes to innovation, because I've watched the amount of innovation in other industries, in manufacturing, self-driving cars, for instance, right? The automobile industry has had to really rely on new partners, new suppliers that they never dealt with before, who are bringing advanced software programming, LiDAR systems, right? Vision systems and detection systems, sensors. And so they've really had to look to them as the source of innovation to enable self-driving and enable safer cars, right? Mm-hmm. In the CPG industry, I know there's a lot of R&D budget there, and they're constantly perfecting that. But how much of the innovation in the actual product itself and the ingredients that go into the products comes from the supplier side?
Not enough today. We could do better. I'll share a quick story that has really shaped this SRM. I'll keep it short.
Sure.
When I was at Procter and I had all of the Pringles ingredients and packaging globally, we had a flavor supplier in US, flavor supplier in Europe. And the US and the European flavor supplier and the R&D lead on ingredients and formulation came to me and said, we should get rid of so-and-so because they're not as good as the European supplier. And they convinced me, and I probably was too young in my career, didn't ask enough questions, tell me more on why. I trusted them. So we went to dinner with the CEO and the head of sales. And it was to inform them that their contract wasn't going to be renewed and we were going to part ways. So we sat down and I had to be the spokesperson and just shared the innovation's too slow. We're getting more innovation from the other supplier. We feel that it's right for the global business because Pringles intends to expand and flavors are the in-out flavor is so important in a snack. You see that with the competition even more keenly. So the CEO, after I talked and I thought I was eloquently, firing him, he looked at me and said, "Do I have permission to speak?" This guy was as old as my father at the time. And I'm like,
Right.
"Jack, of course." He said, "I'm glad you're firing me. Let me tell you, you're my worst customer. You take
Oh,
30
wow.
iterations to go to market. You don't share your panel results. You don't tell us what the flavorists are trying to do. You give us a generic profile. Well, let me tell you about my best customer. 180 degrees opposite. 3 iterations, we go to market. I don't waste time. I don't waste samples. So I'm glad you're firing me." And I was like, holy cow. So I
Yeah.
looked at the buyers and I looked at the head of R&D ingredient, and I went back to Jack and the salesperson, and I said, "Could we take a break for 5 minutes? You guys stay here. We'll be right back." And we went out in the lobby of this restaurant. I was like, "Guys, this is all new to me. What's true and what's not? Well, we know they can do more, but we don't trust our suppliers." And I'm like, "Okay, these are all problems." So I went back in and I said, "Jack, I'm sorry that I didn't have all the facts. Why don't we do a pilot test on this new seasoning? What if we can work differently, give you the info that your flavorists need from our flavorists and panels, and try? And if it's successful, we can revisit the relationship." So we did that. We changed our paradigms. We changed how we interacted. Their team was great. They never missed a beat. We had a flavor, and it wasn't even 6 weeks. It was 3 or 4 weeks, and it was right on point. And it was one of the better in and outs. And until that supplier was acquired a couple years later, they were still in the portfolio and earned more business through that. And so that's where I think an example of the not invented here, we know better on innovation comes to life, because if you tell the supplier what you're really trying to do and describe it, they'll respond. But important lesson, and that is what shaped a lot of my SRM feelings today, and how important it is to have that dialogue.
Yeah, it's amazing when you hear it from the other side, and applause to that gentleman. He lived up to his duty of candor that he had as a leader, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, he had nothing to lose at the moment. He was at the Last Supper, literally and figuratively. But, it sounds like you turned it around, and, and listening to them. So again, I think it drives home that point that you really need to try to work effectively with the suppliers to be
Mhm.
successful at SRM, right?
Yeah,
It's not
right on.
just it's not putting them in a grid and for blocking them. It's really about how do we work together to the greatest
Mhm.
mutual benefit. So it's
Yeah.
awesome.
The art of the possible only happens through discussions and communication. That's right.
Right on. Well, Jim, that's bringing us to the close of our podcast today. It's been awesome to hear you speak and really tap into your expertise around the areas you've been in. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about motivating teams during difficult times. We've talked about how to work more effectively with suppliers and how to go in and really set up a team for success when you go to a new position in a company. So it's been a great series of topics that we've bounced around, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I've learned a lot listening to what you had to say, and I'm sure our audience appreciates it as well. So thank you for being here today, and if there's any last words you'd like to convey, please let me know right now.
Well, first, Greg, thank you to you and the team for the opportunity. I've never done anything like this, but I guess as I reflect, I have a fair bit of experience, and I'm happy to share. Just in conclusion, I think more than anything, a good supply chain leader understands everything from the intake to the final product. And for those that are listening that might be younger in their career, I really encourage you to learn all the steps of the value chain, because knowledge is power in this case, and knowledge is effectiveness for what your team you're leading, doesn't have to be procurement, can better drive value with suppliers, for the organization, and with other functions. So thank you for the chance to reflect a bit on a long career, and I look forward to continuing dialogue.
Great. Until next time, Jim, it's been great, and have a fantastic day. Take care.